It's budget day, so it means that taxes will be going up. In fact, taxes have been rising for several years, leaving the UK with record tax rates. But it was supposed to be very different. In 2024, the budget included 40 billion of tax rises, but the Chancellor assured the country, we are not going to come back with more tax increases or indeed more borrowing. The problem is that the Chancellor took a gamble, that the UK economy, that has struggled for so many years, would suddenly start to grow at a faster rate. But if anything, a series of global events, plus constant U-turns on policy, tax rises themselves, and an unprecedented degree of uncertainty have all caused growth to dip and unemployment to rise. And the outcome is that government borrowing has exceeded all the previous expectations. And now we are back in November 2025 like Groundhog Day. The real question is not how much are taxes going up this year, but how much will they have to increase in the rest of the Parliament? Because the economic forces which squeeze spending and tax are not going to be solved by this budget. The Chancellor had three big problems. The first is that the economy has been terrible for 15 years. Low growth, low productivity, rising debt really is the worst possible inheritance. But the second thing is that the government tied themselves in knots by promising they wouldn't raise major taxes. But if you want to increase spending, try to reverse austerity, and meet fiscal rules and avoid major tax rises, it was just an impossible equation. Trying to magic a solution involved quite a bit of wishful thinking, and it led to higher tax on employers' national insurance in an effort to avoid taxing workers. And then the Chancellor allowed herself only a very small fiscal headroom. But when there was a U-turn on winter fuel, U-turn on welfare reform, and a slowing economy, this headroom was soon wiped out and replaced with yet another deficit. The truth is that although you can say it is unlucky that Donald Trump introduced a trade war in April, it's also inevitable that the global economy will always have some setbacks. In fact, it could have been a lot worse if it wasn't for falling oil and gas prices. UK inflation would be even worse. And inflation of over 3.5% has been really a problem for the UK, not just in terms of cost of living crisis, but in terms of higher interest rates, higher bond yields, and rising debt interest payments. And it doesn't help that the rise in national insurance on employers was one of the more damaging taxes, blamed for both rising inflation, firms passed their cost increases onto consumers, but also rising unemployment, as firms were less willing to hire new workers. Now, I've been following the budget for many years, but I've never known such a degree of pessimism and uncertainty with U-turns about U-turns. Last month, the ONS reported a 1.1% fall in retail sales, much worse than expected, and all the leading indicators really do suggest a slowdown in the economy as people nervously await the upcoming budget. And we shouldn't underestimate how much uncertainty weighs down an economy. But the big question really is whether this budget will be able to end that uncertainty and talk about future tax rises. Unfortunately, I fear not, for quite a few reasons. Firstly, government spending increases were weighted towards the front end of a parliament. As we get closer to 2029, departments will once again be squeezed by very small spending rises. That means doctors and nurses thinking of going on strike for higher pay, they won't be happy what comes in a few years' time. Secondly, OBR forecasts for productivity growth have frequently been over-optimistic. It's almost comical how bad they have been. Well, comical, not really very funny, but it also means that forecasts for borrowing have been over-optimistic, and it's hard to find any particularly strong reason why this will change. But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the UK faces a range of long-term pressures on spending. Now, the biggest spending pressures are coming from pension benefits. The triple lock means pensions can rise faster than both wages and inflation. But with a growing share of people of retirement age, it just means that pensions would take a larger and larger share of GDP and tax revenue. But it's not just pensions. Health-related benefits are set to rise as the economy experiences that double whammy, rising inactivity rates amongst young people and a rising welfare bill to deal with health-related problems. And really, wherever you look at the British state, there is need for more spending, but kind of very sluggish tax revenues. Whether it's defence, healthcare or energy, there are arguments not just that spending should increase, but that it should rise as a share of GDP. And where's that going to come from? A lot of the unexpected increase in government borrowing has come from local government, who are weighed down by growing demands for social care, special needs education, and a housing crisis. And the UK's rising debt burden since 2009 creates another problem, a rise in debt interest payments. And this is all exacerbated by the fact that UK bond yields have risen and are the highest in the G7. Now, partly this reflects high inflation, high interest rates, but it also reflects a bond premium on how markets view UK debt. In other words, the UK faces a bond Moran premium, so it's costing more to borrow because of a chaotic fiscal policy and the long-term debt trajectory. And without any radical change, markets are quite pessimistic about what will happen in the future. And given all the U-turns and lack of strategic thinking, bond markets are becoming frustrated with government policy. Now you could say, who cares about the bond market? But if you are selling 300 billion worth of gilts a year and rely on overseas buyers as well to buy them, good luck with telling the bond market to be just a bit nicer. The problem for the UK is that it is seen as non-politically viable to consider changing pension spending, even if we can't afford it. At the same time, it's seen as politically non-viable to increase major taxes like income tax or VAT. If there's one thing I would do differently as a chancellor, it would be very clear the kind of trade-offs the country faces. Yes, we can have a pension triple lock and pay more of our tax revenue on pensions, but it does mean we have to do something like increase the basic rate of income tax. I'm nothing per se against getting high pensions. I'll be a pensioner myself in the not too distant future. Also, the issues like raising the cap on two-child benefit would give bigger benefits in terms of reducing poverty, especially for children. Yes, we could have a wealth tax that raises 5 to 10 billion a year, but it's not going to solve the UK's underlying trajectory of rising debt. The UK's tax system is actually surprisingly progressive, at least in terms of income. Since the financial crash, we've had taken a bigger share of tax from top earners. Partly that reflects higher income inequality, that the higher paid workers have done pretty well in recent decades. But partly it's just more progressive. Now, some people might say, why can't it just be more like Denmark and Norway? True, they have high tax rates, but also they have a pretty good welfare state and the economy seems to be doing quite well. Well, we could follow that model, but they fund it through higher basic rate of income tax and a VAT rate of 25%. You can't necessarily fund every wish list by just taxing the rich. Nevertheless, I do think the Chancellor's missed an opportunity not to tax the banks more since coming to power. They have been quite profitable and have made quite a lot of money from quantitative easing, and a few billion from banks would certainly have been less politically damaging than, say, means testing winter fuel, which only raised about half £1 billion. Now, are there any reasons to be optimistic about the situation the UK faces itself? Well, you could argue that the pessimism and frustration is more related to the surface of how badly the whole process has been handled. And although weak, the UK economy is not a complete basket case. Growth is still positive, wages for the low paid have increased, and although unemployment's ticked up, it's still relatively low compared to the past. Economies are flexible and they can recover if circumstances are right. And in 2026, we could see lower inflation, lower interest rates, and better growth, which would start to improve the outlook. But I'm not particularly convinced by that logic. Although inflation and interest rates probably will come down, I don't think there's been any strategic solution to the long-term pressures facing the UK budget. Because the unwelcome truth about the budget is it's not about 20 or 30 billion here or there. It's really about the hundreds of billions that the government is currently liable for in terms of maintenance backlog, rising pensions, rising healthcare, and many other things too. And the question is, are we ready to pay for it? I don't think that people are particularly keen on the idea. Anyway, this video goes into more detail about why the borrowing and debt is worse than it actually looks on the surface.